Once upon a time, the maker of man, the hunter of the worm, the gigantic masked god, Menoth, stalked Cain. In the shadow that his looming shape threw on the still-forming world, and after the passage of his burning footsteps, the first mewling men and women crawled forth from the foaming waters to seek shelter in the lands that were new and untamed. Humanity had watched as their towering creator abandoned them to the hungry and thorny world, chasing after his ultimate prey. He did not hear as they called out to him and prayed for guidance. He simply left them behind. Perhaps Menoth did not want to hear them, because he wished only to hunt the great beast that prowled the tangled forests and flashed across the rocky peaks of the new world, the devourer worm. It was the ever-changing beast that gave the wolf its fangs and the lion its claws, the beast of all shapes, and the creator of man waged a never-ending war with one another, both unable to overcome the strength of their opponent. Consumed by his desire to win this unwinnable war, Menoth had no time for trifling concerns like humankind. So the wild folk learned to live without their maker, hiding in caves and cutting their own path through the snarled realm in which they had been left alone. They gathered into families and clans, and those clans grew into tribes. In time, they would spread across the land, living, hunting, and striving together against the unforgiving world. Humanity was free-thinking then, and uninhibited. Each and every one of them was able to hunt and love and die for his or her own terms. They wandered where they pleased, keeping only the possessions they truly needed to survive, having no interest in amassing great piles of useless things. These first people lived within the pulse and thrum of the primal world. Every day was a new opportunity to explore and experience Cain. They learned their strength and tested their cunning. All lived according to their own desires and needs. They told stories by moonlight, sang songs in the blackest depths of the night. Their spirits became strong because they had survived, wise because they had learned from one another, and fierce because the weakness was purged out of them by this uncompromising world. When what they had seized from the world they savored, and their songs rang out beneath the moon and the stars. When they died, their souls left their flesh behind to be untethered and free. After a time, the glint of these raised and released spirits and the raw vitality of the wild folk living on Cain drew the eye of the Maker away from his hunt. When he witnessed what his creations had become, the masked god began to crave the pure essence lying deep within their marrow. Menoth hungered for their souls. Menoth knew he simply could not reach out and claim them, for all of humanity had buried strength that could rattle the oldest oaks and grind mountains down to powder. If these free people discovered that power, they might unite against him. They might reject him in favor of other gods, such as the distant maiden who danced across the stars. They might even kindle their own power to become gods of their own making. Already many of these mortals had turned to the worship of Menoth's foremost enemy, the great beast. He saw this jealously, and as the hunter praised not his name, but that of the worm. The hunter, the hungry spirit, would not hesitate to claim their spirits when they passed from the world of the living to the land of the dead. And worst of all, beyond all these worlds, a greater darkness greedily waited, and like ravenous spiders that hide between the walls, the dwellers of this outer darkness were eager to add human souls to their collection. Chapter 1. Humanity Enslaved. Fearing the loss of his creation's souls, Menoff devised a cunning plan to convince humankind to willingly become his servants. In Gyrmkin, the land of the spirits, he built a vast and breathtakingly beautiful city. All souls who could reach its gates would be welcomed inside to inhabit its streets and structures, and there become an army beyond any conceived by mortal minds. It was a city built to expand, to accommodate all who could and would arrive across the vastness of time. Soon it was sprawling larger than a continent, bordering on high walls of alabaster stone, clad in bronze and shining gold. This city would become the home of all the souls Menoff could lure to him. Some came to him unbidden, drawn to their creator by some inner need for his cruel neglect, but not enough to sate his appetites, not enough to guard the monumental walls and perform the necessary labors of his city, not enough to serve as his soldiers and slaves in the endless war against his adversary. His greed and gluttony were boundless, and so he devised 4 clever gifts to draw his abandoned children back to him: the flame, the wall, the sheaf, and the law. Some would say any true or kind father would have given such gifts to them without a price, or better, would have simply helped them discover these gifts on their own. The Maker devised these gifts so the wild folks would worship him and abandon their uninhibited and primitive ways. He sought to instill in them a fear of the land and its beasts, a fear that would stay with them even beyond their deaths. Then, when they died and their souls passed to Gyrmkin, all those who claimed the gifts would be trapped in his city and become his eternal warriors. Their power would be channeled and chained to his purpose forever. Perhaps the masked god thought these gifts as a true blessing. He himself has never been comfortable in the unsettled places. Even the wind and the rain angered him. It may be when he looked upon his forgotten children, he wanted to make amends for abandoning them for so long. But a god looks with a god's eyes, not a mortal's. And the Maker did not see how receiving his gifts could poison their spirits, how it would chain them to one another and rob them of their freedom to make them clever and strong. In time, humankind would hold dominion over one another and would desire more power still. Each bit of it they claimed would stain their hearts until once what was been a beating, hot-blooded muscle became a dark and charred chunk of coal. Menoff offered his poisoned gifts, and many claimed them. His priest kings were the first to taste the poison, and they joyfully distributed it to all who would hear their honeyed words. The first gift Menoff offered to his children was the flame, and many said, "Feel, now the cold wind will not bite when we lie down to sleep, and the light will drive back the shadows. For in the shadows we see so many hungry things, eager to taste our blood." And so they took the gift and built fires to chase away the shadows of their imaginations. They constructed hearths of stacked stone and cut down trees to feed the flickering flames. They stopped wandering, for who would want to stray away from the light, the warmth, the comfort of the hearth? Those who took the flame soon forgot how to see by star and moonlight, deepening their fear of the night. Next, Menoff gave them the wall. They said, "Look, behind our walls we are safe from the wolves in the nighttime and safe from our neighbors in the daytime. For who could breach a wall built of such stout and sturdy stones?" And so they accepted this gift, labored to build more walls, carving the land into pieces, and they fought to keep one another outside of the walls they called their own. Any who crossed these walls they named trespassers and spies, and they killed such intruders for refusing to abide by the web of walls that Menoff had trapped them in. And then Menoff gave them the sheaf and said, "Taste! Now our stomachs We'll no longer ache from hunger when we are clumsy hunters, and our prey eludes us. And so some of the people plowed the vast fields and sowed grain, for which they ate until they were fat and lazy, leaning and learning to prefer even mealy bread to the flesh of beasts hunted honestly and freshly killed. Those who toiled in the field became reliant on those who bore spears to protect them, and so they became servants to the Lord with the most spears. The grain they harvested was taken from them, and thus were links added to the chain of slavery. And last, Menoff gave the gift of the law to his people, and they said, "Listen, now we no longer need wonder if we are good or if we are evil, if we are wrong or if we are right, because Menoff has given us the law. We must only obey." Some among them learned the law, surrendering the need and the right to think for themselves. They came to see how much better they were than others, how only cruel punishment could hope to bring the wicked back to the path of the righteous. Some submitted their authority over the rest, gaining the power to decide who lived behind which walls, who would be warmed by the fire, who would feast well on the sheaf, and who, by the law, would be made kings and queens over all others. And those held in the highest regard were the priests, who spoke praises to Menoff and took credit for the bounty given to them. The unchained and the unbowed. Thus civilization was born, and soon turned into the gave birth to Ichthyr. Sinat, founder of the city, was in truth the first and greatest of Menoff's lickspittles, a priest who did more than any other to further spread Menoff's poison. All in Ichthyr would bow before him, surrendering their freedom, their thoughts, and their very souls. But not all those who were offered the gifts were so eager to hand over their freedom. A few saw through Menoff's promises. They knew what he offered was poison. Decrying his gifts, they said, "Keep your flame and keep your wall, your sheaf and your law. You would enslave us in this life and the next. You would steal our freedom and force us into your city to serve you. Look how it destroys those within it. They are senseless and fat, greedy and lazy. The only gift you offer us is the rod of corruption." And so these few brave, free men and women spurned the gifts of the Creator. The first to rebel was the child. Menoff's law placed the parents above their children, and they were expected to devise and enforce petty rules about what was acceptable and what was forbidden, what could be done and what shouldn't. The child hated these laws because they prevented her from doing what she wanted for no good reason at all. The child chose to be defiant and would not obey. Her soul gleamed with the wild power of untamable innocence and the rage of youth. Her angry screams deafened any who would tell her what to do. So much so that they could not even hear their own thoughts. No wall or chain could contain her. Never would she accept the slaver's chain. Then also came the Watcher, the Wanderer. The walls that people had built were made to keep others from wandering, to keep them out of certain places. A road served as a different sort of limitation, dictating a set and finite path chosen by whoever laid its stones first. The Wanderer did not accept such constraints on his freedom. An individual should be able to walk wherever he pleases, so the Wanderer moved with no regard for these barriers, whether erected by mortal or god. He discovered he could blaze new and impossible paths that no other man could fathom, and when he dared to follow them, he could journey to places beyond imagining, even into the otherwise intangible stuff of dreams. As Menoph's law sapped others of their powers of imagination, one woman rejected the law he wrote defining what is and what isn't. The dreamer wanted nothing to do with the reality that Menoph had created, and she refused to accept it. Instead, she dreamed up wholly new realities to reside in, realities so vivid and vibrant that the world around her began to take on new life and fanciful life in its envy of what she could imagine. Last but not least was a man who rejected all, not only rejected Menoph's gifts and the society that came with them, but all other people and everything in the world as well. He hated Menoph for his creation, hated humanity even more, and hated the way Menoph's law drew people together and encouraged them to mind one another's business. He wanted nothing more to do than be left alone by all, to live as a hermit. His spite and enmity was so absolute that the very bodies of those who came too close to him would become to wither and ache. Animals and plants would shrivel and die if they lingered in his presence. His desire for solitude became itself a force of nature, dividing him from all else. In time, he sat alone on a barren plot of earth as the spiteful despot of his own empty kingdom, a self-satisfied king of nothing. The defiance shown by these rebellious ones enraged Menoph. It was not just their rejection that galled him, but also how, in turning their backs on their creator so irrevocably, they had discovered the greater power residing within their own individual souls. If others had discovered this gift, the god would be undone. His plan had been so clever, and his gift so devisedly so cunning. But these petulant humans had tossed them aside and without a thought. Menoph desired a tool to drag these disobedient creations back to his worship. Failing that, he intended to end their lives in a way so terrible that it would serve as a curse and a warning to others with the temerity to refuse him. So Menoph kindled the power within the most devout of those who had accepted his gifts and abided by his laws, and they were elevated as priests and kings among humankind. They struck out across the world, emerging from their cities to put the torch to all of the Creator's children who chose to act against him. The priest-kings and the champions of Menoph led their armies and cleaved through the savages beyond the wall. Their names are uplifted as golden pillars of the civilized. After Sinat arose Golavant, Kardovic, Thrace, Belkor, and Geth. But there was one who came even before Sinat, one who was erased and stricken from all records. He was first. He was the highest and became the lowest. His name is gone, replaced with a word that transcribes his very existence. Heretic. The heretic was a priest-king who blazed like the first light of dawn, beating back the shadows of Menoph's name. He carved a bold path along which left countless hamlets would one day grow into cities, and those cities would grow into kingdoms. His light cast a long shadow that eclipsed even Sinat himself, who he knew and instructed. Indeed, much of that is credited to Sinat should be cast at the feet of the heretic instead. By Menoph himself, he was guided into erecting the grand city of Arsenia, and he soon expanded civilization to the north and the west, spreading the fires of Menoph. As his legend grew, however, the heretic saw the divine for what it truly was. Looking at his own self-supremacy and all that he commanded, he realized all mortals within them a touch of the divine power. He learned that his might had not been bestowed upon him by Menoph, but rather the god had simply kindled that which was always been there. The heretic himself knew to be singular and special, and he began to dream beneath the mask worn by Menoph was a hidden face identical to his own. But in this revelation, he also saw the world as flawed and ill-made. Menoph's gifts were but a gilded cage meant to distract humanity from the truth that they were all enslaved and deaf. If he truly was the inheritor of power to rival Menoph's own, the heretic knew he must reshape the world into a new form and shatter the cage and the bondage and the chains. Most of all, he saw that Menoph was not just a god, not a just god in that. Menoph did not punish the wicked, those who wielded his gifts like weapons against their neighbors, nor did he reward those who selflessly cared for others with no material benefit to themselves. Instead, the god rewarded only obedience, punished only defiance. The heretic was the first to have the scales of deception fall from his eyes, but he would not be the last. From that point forward, the heretic refused to wield his power in the God's name, bending it instead for his own purposes. He would not remain Menoph's puppet, knowing himself to be his creator's equal, if not his superior. He harnessed his own divine might and stoked the fire of godhood within him into a roaring flame. And the heretic raised his face to the heavens and bellowed at his creator, "Ye have cast us in thine own image. We are born of thine own flesh. Whatever ye can will, so can we."